The story of the Roman Empire is one of humanity's most enduring narratives, a tale that stretches across more than a millennium, from small beginnings on the banks of the Tiber River to the vast dominion that once encircled the Mediterranean and beyond. To fall asleep to its history is to drift gently into the flow of centuries, where city-states rise, armies march, philosophies flourish, and monuments of marble and concrete shape the very idea of civilization. Tonight, as we explore the Roman Empire, we will not hurry through battles and emperors alone. Instead, we will walk calmly through streets, stand quietly in temples, and pause to observe daily lives as they unfold in markets, baths, and villas. This is a journey through the quiet grandeur of the past, a companion for your rest, told with patience and reflection. The origins of Rome are themselves wrapped in legend. According to Roman tradition, the twins Romulus and Remus, raised by a she-wolf, founded the city in 753 BCE. While historians today understand this as myth rather than fact, it reveals something essential. The Romans saw their beginnings as intertwined with destiny and divine favor. Archaeological evidence suggests Rome emerged as a cluster of small villages on 7 hills overlooking the Tiber River, strategically located for trade and protection. In its early centuries, Rome was not yet an empire, but a monarchy, then a republic, shaped by struggle and compromise, its people learning to balance power between patrician elites and the broader citizenry. As we drift through the early centuries of Rome, we see how its society was both practical and adaptive. The Romans borrowed much from neighboring cultures. The Etruscans contributed engineering techniques, such as the arch, while the Greeks inspired religion, philosophy, and art. But the Romans made these traditions their own, always adjusting them for governance and expansion. Their gift was not so much in inventing new ideas, but in organizing, codifying, and extending them, whether in law, architecture, or administration. Rome's genius was one of integration, to take what was useful and weave it into the fabric of their civilization. The Republic, established in 509 BCE after the overthrow of the monarchy, introduced a system of checks and balances that would echo through history. The Senate, composed of Rome's aristocrats, wielded great influence, while elected magistrates carried out the laws, and assemblies allowed citizens a voice, though a limited one. Over time, tensions between patricians and plebeians, the upper and lower classes, led to reforms that expanded rights, including the creation of the office of tribune, who could veto legislation harmful to the people. These struggles shaped Roman political culture, instilling the belief that no single individual should dominate unchecked. Yet, as centuries passed, Rome's growing power tested these ideals. Rome's expansion was both relentless and transformative. Through conquest, alliance, and colonization, the Republic extended its reach across the Italian peninsula. Each victory brought not only territory, but also new peoples, customs, and challenges. Rome's armies were disciplined and resilient, but equally important was its policy of extending citizenship, in varying degrees, to conquered peoples. This inclusiveness allowed Rome to bind together diverse groups into a shared system, ensuring loyalty while cultivating a sense of collective destiny. At the same time, military service tied individuals to the state, creating bonds of duty that sustained Rome's growth. By the 2nd century BCE, Rome's influence stretched across the Mediterranean. The defeat of Carthage in the Punic Wars gave Rome control of vast territories in Spain and North Africa, while victories in Greece and Asia Minor brought the treasures of Hellenistic civilization into Roman hands. Yet expansion also brought strain. Wealth flowed into Rome, but it often concentrated in the hands of elites, while small farmers faced displacement. Slavery, fueled by conquest, became central to the economy, creating deep divisions within society. Political life grew more contentious as ambitious leaders sought personal glory at the expense of republican traditions. This tension between republican ideals and imperial ambitions eventually culminated in civil wars. Figures such as Julius Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus rose to prominence, their alliances and rivalries reshaping the political landscape. Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon in 49 BCE marked a turning point, signaling the collapse of the Republic and the rise of personal rule. His assassination in 44 BCE did not restore the old system, but instead opened the way for further conflict until his adopted heir, Octavian, later Augustus, emerged as Rome's first emperor. The transition from republic to empire was not abrupt but gradual, a careful balancing act in which Augustus preserved the language of republican governance while consolidating ultimate authority. Under his rule, Rome entered the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, a period of relative stability that allowed for prosperity, cultural flourishing, and monumental building projects. The Colosseum, aqueducts, and roads stand as enduring testaments to this era. But behind the grandeur, daily life continued. Farmers tended their fields, merchants traded goods, families gathered for meals, and citizens attended public games, their lives intertwined with the rhythms of empire. In the centuries that followed, Rome experienced triumphs and tribulations. Emperors came and went, some wise and capable, others cruel or inept. The empire reached its greatest territorial extent under Trajan, stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia. Christianity emerged, first as a persecuted faith and later as the state religion, reshaping the spiritual landscape of Europe. Crises of succession, economic strain, and external pressures eventually weakened Rome, culminating in the fall of the Western Empire in 476 CE. Yet even in decline, Rome's legacy endured. In law, language, architecture, and ideals of governance, echoes that still resonate today. As we prepare to journey through the chapters ahead, imagine yourself walking through the Forum of Rome, where marble columns rise against the sky and the voices of senators and citizens mingle. Imagine the quiet hum of an aqueduct carrying water to the city, or the sound of sandals against cobblestones as legionaries march. This is not a hurried tale of conquest alone, but a gentle unfolding of a civilization that shaped the world. As you listen, let the centuries drift by like a flowing river, carrying you toward restful sleep. The beginning of Rome is a story that lies halfway between myth and archaeology, somewhere between the poetry of legend and the soil of the Italian hills. To understand how the Roman Empire came to dominate much of the known world, we first pause at its most fragile stage, its founding myths and early history. These tales are not only charming bedtime stories, but also clues to how the Romans saw themselves, weaving their identity into a grand narrative of destiny, struggle, and divine guidance. The most famous myth, of course, is that of Romulus and Remus. The twin brothers, abandoned at birth by the river Tiber, are said to have been suckled by a she-wolf before being taken in by a shepherd and his wife. As adults, they set out to found a city, but disagreement over its location led to a quarrel in which Romulus killed his brother. Romulus then named the new settlement after himself, Rome. This story, though drenched in violence and rivalry, carries the Roman conviction that conflict and strength are woven into the origins of greatness. It also reveals the Roman belief in the favor of the gods, for divine intervention seemed to touch their beginnings. Yet beneath the legends, archaeologists uncover a more practical tale. By the 8th century BCE, small villages were forming atop the 7 hills overlooking the Tiber River. These hills offered natural defenses, while the river provided access to trade routes that stretched across central Italy. The early Romans were not isolated. They were shaped by neighboring peoples. The Etruscans to the north contributed ideas in religion, architecture, and city planning, while Greek colonies in southern Italy introduced gods, myths, and cultural practices. Rome, even from its infancy, was absorbing and adapting, weaving together strands from many traditions into its own fabric. The early kings of Rome, according to later tradition, were 7 in number, each remembered for certain deeds. Romulus, the founder; Numa Pompilius, a king of peace who shaped religious customs; Tullus Hostilius, a warrior king; and Tarquin the Proud, whose arrogance supposedly led to the fall of the monarchy. While historians debate the accuracy of these figures, the stories serve as moral lessons, illustrating the values Romans prized: bravery, piety, discipline, and a suspicion of unchecked power. Tarquin's downfall, in particular, reflected the Roman determination never again to be ruled by a king. Daily life in early Rome was simple, yet ordered. The houses of common people were made of mud, brick, and thatch, clustered closely together, while wealthier families built larger dwellings with courtyards. The Forum, Rome's central public space, emerged gradually as the heart of civic life, where markets bustled and temples stood. Farming was the backbone of society, with grain, olives, and grapes providing sustenance, while livestock added strength and trade value. Roman families, or familiae, were patriarchal units ruled by the paterfamilias, the male head who held authority over all members. Religion permeated daily life. Small household shrines honored domestic gods, while larger rituals bound the community to the divine. Even at this stage, one sees Rome's unusual ability to endure and expand. Where other hill communities remained small, Rome reached outward. The Tiber's crossing point made it a hub for trade, where salt and agricultural goods flowed. Military organization also set Rome apart. Each male citizen was expected to serve in war when needed, forming a disciplined fighting force that defended the city and extended its influence. The Romans' stern discipline, known as disciplina, became a hallmark of their success. It is striking how quickly Rome moved from a cluster of huts to a city of stone. By the 6th century BCE, under Etruscan influence, Rome was building monumental structures. The Cloaca Maxima, an early drainage system, and the first stone temples reflected not only practical needs, but also a sense of civic pride. These public works required collective labor, reminding us that Rome's greatness lay in its community as much as in its leaders. The Roman character, even in these early centuries, was one of resilience. Myths reminded citizens that they were born of conflict and survival. Archaeology shows how they adapted ideas from others while fiercely preserving their independence. The removal of kings in 509 BCE marked a turning point, leading to the birth of the Republic. But even this act carried forward the lessons of the early monarchy. Authority must be checked, and the community must guard against tyranny. As we drift from the mists of legend into the clarity of history, we see how Rome's beginnings were both humble and profound. A city rising from marshy lands, borrowing from neighbors, binding its people with ritual and discipline, and weaving a story of destiny that would justify centuries of conquest. To fall asleep with these images is to imagine the glow of small fires flickering in huts on the hills, the sound of shepherds' flutes by the river, and the murmur of prayers to household gods. In those quiet moments, Rome was only a village, but within it lay the seeds of an empire that would one day circle the Mediterranean like a crown of stone and sea. The monarchy having ended, Rome now stepped into a new phase of its existence, the Republic. The year 509 BCE, remembered by Romans as the beginning of their liberty, marked the overthrow of Tarquin the Proud and the creation of a system that sought to prevent tyranny by dividing authority among many hands. In this second stage of our story, we watch Rome experiment with institutions, laws, and traditions that became its defining legacy, not just for itself, but for future civilizations that would look back and draw inspiration. The Republic was not a democracy in the modern sense, yet it established a careful balance of power among magistrates, the Senate, and the assemblies. At the top were two consuls, elected annually, who commanded the armies and administered the state. The brevity of their terms and the fact that there were always two of them reflected Rome's suspicion of concentrated authority. Alongside the consuls existed a range of other magistrates, praetors to oversee justice, quaestors to manage finances, and censors to keep the census and guard public morals. Each role was limited in scope, ensuring that no single official could dominate. The Senate, composed largely of patricians, the hereditary elite, emerged as the most enduring and influential institution. Though it technically served as an advisory body, in practice it guided policy, controlled finances, and steered foreign affairs. Its prestige and continuity gave it weight that outlasted the shifting magistracies. The assemblies, meanwhile, provided citizens a voice. Organized by tribe or by wealth category, these gatherings allowed Romans to elect officials, pass laws, and vote on matters of war and peace. Yet power within them was not evenly distributed. The votes of wealthier citizens carried more influence, a reminder that Rome's republican ideals were tempered by social hierarchy. The Republic's early centuries were shaped by a struggle known as the conflict of the orders, a long contest between patricians and plebeians. Plebeians, who made up the majority of the population, demanded greater rights and protections against the dominance of aristocrats. Through patient resistance, such as withdrawing en masse from the city in what was called a secession, they secured gradual reforms. Among the most important was the creation of the office of tribune of the plebs, officials who could veto decisions harmful to the common people. Another milestone was the writing of the 12 Tables around 450 BCE, Rome's first published code of law. These bronze tablets, displayed in the Forum, gave citizens transparency and a sense of fairness, replacing arbitrary judgments with known rules. The Republic's legal framework became one of its proudest contributions to history. Roman law emphasized concepts such as contracts, property rights, and the protection of citizens. Though evolving over centuries, these principles later influenced European law and, indirectly, modern systems around the world. For Romans themselves, the law was more than regulation. It was the visible backbone of civic life, a shared set of rules that bound patrician and plebeian alike into one body politic. While laws and institutions formed the Republic's skeleton, civic culture was its living spirit. Roman values, expressed in the Latin word mos maiorum, the customs of the ancestors, emphasized duty, honor, and discipline. Citizens were expected to serve the state in both peace and war. Military service was not only an obligation, but a privilege, binding men to Rome's defense and expansion. Public service, too, was seen as a duty of the elite, who were expected to pursue offices in a career path known as the cursus honorum. Prestige came not from wealth alone, but from demonstrating virtue in service to the community. The Republic was also marked by deep religiosity. Priests, known as pontiffs and augurs, interpreted the will of the gods through rituals and signs, ensuring that public decisions carried divine sanction. Every war, every law, and every major undertaking was framed as an act not only of human will, but of sacred alignment. This religious dimension gave Roman politics a solemnity that underscored its gravity, even as everyday life continued with markets, farms, and family rituals. Yet the Republic was not free of conflict. The balance of power that sustained it was fragile, often tested by ambition and rivalry. Families of the elite, or gentes, competed fiercely for offices, honors, and military commands. Feuds could flare, but the system endured because it spread authority broadly and built loyalty through shared participation. When crises struck, Romans even had a mechanism for temporary concentration of power: the dictatorship. In moments of emergency, a single man could be appointed with supreme authority, but only for 6 months. This solution captured the Roman genius for pragmatism, allowing flexibility without permanently endangering liberty. Daily life in Republican Rome was vibrant and varied. Farmers still tilled the countryside, but within the city, one could stroll through the Forum and see law courts in session, senators in debate, and vendors calling out their wares. Children learned to read and write Latin, sometimes also Greek, while households honored ancestors with masks and memorials. Family and state were closely intertwined. The authority of the paterfamilias over his household echoed the authority of the magistrates over the state, both rooted in the idea of discipline and order. The Republic was more than a political experiment. It was a culture of shared values, carefully cultivated institutions, and an adaptability that allowed Rome to grow steadily. By granting concessions to plebeians, integrating new peoples, and finding practical solutions to crises, Rome forged resilience. And it is this resilience that carried the Republic forward, enabling it to face the next great challenge, extending its power beyond its immediate neighbors. As you drift now towards sleep, imagine the sounds of a Republican morning in Rome. In the Forum, magistrates announce decrees, scribes carve letters into bronze tablets, and citizens gather to cast votes. Priests read omens from the flight of birds, and soldiers prepare to muster at the Campus Martius. In this hum of civic life, the Republic lives, a system fragile yet enduring, built upon the conviction that power, shared and checked, creates stability. It is here that Rome's true greatness begins to take shape, for its institutions will carry it from a city among many to the ruler of Italy, and eventually to an empire spanning continents. As the Republic matured, Rome's ambitions expanded beyond the walls of the city and the banks of the Tiber. In this section, we explore how Rome secured dominance over the Italian peninsula, transforming itself from a regional power into the heart of a growing empire. This story is one of determination, adaptation, and a remarkable ability to weave conquered peoples into the Roman fabric. The conquest of Italy unfolded gradually between the 5th and 3rd centuries BCE. Rome began by contending with its immediate neighbors, the Latin communities scattered across central Italy. These Latin peoples shared language and customs with the Romans, yet they often competed for land and influence. The Latin League, an alliance of these towns, eventually clashed with Rome. After years of struggle, Rome emerged victorious in the Latin War around 338 BCE. Instead of imposing heavy burdens, Rome offered a mixture of treaties, alliances, and, crucially, partial citizenship to many Latins. This policy created loyalty while binding diverse communities to Rome's destiny. Rome's genius was not only military, but also diplomatic. With each new conquest, Rome adjusted its approach. Some cities were granted full citizenship, others partial rights, and still others maintained independence but under Roman leadership. This flexible system, known as the Roman Confederation, ensured that allies had a stake in Rome's success. In contrast to empires that ruled through oppression alone, Rome built loyalty by sharing privileges, though always reserving ultimate authority for itself. Beyond the Latins lay the Etruscans to the north. Once dominant in the region, the Etruscans had heavily influenced early Roman culture, but by the 4th century BCE, they were weakened by internal divisions and external pressures. Rome fought a series of wars against Etruscan cities, eventually bringing them under control. The conquest of Etruria not only secured Rome's northern frontier, but also gave access to fertile lands and valuable resources, strengthening the republic's base. To the south, Rome faced a different challenge: the Samnites, a fierce people of the Apennine Mountains. The Samnite Wars, fought intermittently between 343 and 290 BCE, tested Rome's resilience. These wars were long and difficult, marked by dramatic reversals, such as the humiliating defeat at the Caudine Forks, where Roman soldiers were forced to pass under a yoke in submission. Yet Rome's ability to recover from setbacks became legendary. The Republic reorganized its armies, refined its tactics, and persevered until the Samnites were subdued. Victory over the Samnites opened the way to further expansion across central and southern Italy. By the early 3rd century BCE, Rome had become the dominant power in Italy, but one formidable rival remained: the Greek colonies in the south, known collectively as Magna Graecia. These prosperous cities, such as Tarentum, looked across the sea to Greece for support. In 280 BCE, Tarentum invited King Pyrrhus of Epirus to defend them against Rome. Pyrrhus was a brilliant general, equipped with war elephants unfamiliar to Roman soldiers. His victories at Heraclea and Asculum inflicted heavy losses on Rome, but they were costly to his own forces. So costly that they gave rise to the term Pyrrhic victory, meaning a win gained at such expense that it feels like a defeat. Rome's persistence eventually wore down Pyrrhus, and by 272 BCE, Tarentum and the rest of Magna Graecia were under Roman control. Rome's conquest of Italy was not just about defeating enemies. It was about building infrastructure and fostering unity. Roads, such as the Via Appia, Rome's first great highway, constructed in 312 BCE, linked the city to distant regions, allowing troops and trade to move with speed. Colonies of Roman citizens were established in strategic locations, acting as both military outposts and cultural anchors. These settlements spread Latin language and Roman customs, while also securing loyalty in contested areas. The Italian countryside itself was transformed. Roman farms expanded, often worked by slaves captured in wars. Villas dotted the landscape, while small towns grew around military and trade routes. Markets bustled with grain, wine, and olive oil, exchanged not only within Italy, but increasingly across the Mediterranean. This economic integration reinforced political ties, as communities saw tangible benefits from association with Rome. Culturally, Rome absorbed as much as it imposed. From the Etruscans came religious rituals and architectural forms. From the Greeks, artistic styles, literature, and philosophical ideas. Roman religion expanded to include Greek gods, often renamed and reinterpreted. Athena became Minerva, Zeus became Jupiter, and Apollo was worshipped directly under his Greek name. This willingness to adopt and adapt enriched Roman culture, making it more resilient and more appealing to the diverse peoples it ruled. By the time Rome completed the conquest of Italy in 264 BCE, it had created a solid foundation for further expansion. Its armies were hardened by constant campaigns, its roads and colonies secured its hold, and its policies of integration ensured broad loyalty. Rome now stood as the unchallenged power in Italy, but this position also brought it into conflict with powers beyond the peninsula. To the west lay Carthage, master of the seas and rival for dominance of the Mediterranean. Their clash would become one of the most dramatic rivalries in history. As we drift away from these centuries of conquest, imagine Italy as a mosaic of landscapes. The rugged Apennines, the fertile plains of Campania, the olive groves of Etruria, and the bustling harbors of southern cities. Upon this varied land, Rome had stitched a network of alliances, treaties, and colonies, binding the peninsula into a new unity. From the perspective of sleep, it is a calm vision. Roads stretching into the distance, soldiers marching in disciplined lines, farmers tending vines beneath the Italian sun. The foundation of empire is laid, stone by stone, road by road, promise by promise. With Italy firmly under its sway, Rome soon turned outward, drawn inevitably into the wider Mediterranean world. The peninsula's unification gave Rome strength, but it also brought Rome into contact and ultimately into conflict with another great power, Carthage. The Punic Wars, as these struggles came to be known, not only determined the fate of two mighty states, but also set Rome upon the path to becoming the preeminent power of the Mediterranean basin. Carthage, located in North Africa near modern-day Tunis, was a wealthy maritime empire descended from Phoenician traders. Its strength lay in commerce, seafaring, and naval supremacy. Carthaginian merchants controlled rich trade routes from Spain to Sicily, and their city glittered with wealth. Unlike Rome, which grew through land-based conquest, Carthage relied upon its fleet and mercenary armies, hiring soldiers from many lands to fight in its wars. The contrast between the land-centered, citizen-soldier culture of Rome and the sea-based, mercantile wealth of Carthage set the stage for a clash that would last more than a century. The First Punic War erupted in 264 BCE over control of Sicily, a strategically important island lying between Italy and North Africa. Rome, inexperienced at sea, nonetheless built a fleet from scratch, adopting and adapting the ship designs of others. The Romans introduced a novel device called the corvus, a boarding bridge with a spike that could be dropped onto enemy ships, turning naval battles into something more familiar to Rome: land combat on wooden decks. After more than 2 decades of struggle, Rome triumphed in 241 BCE, gaining Sicily as its first overseas province. Carthage, humiliated and financially weakened, would soon look to Spain for recovery. The Second Punic War, 218 to 201 BCE, is among the most famous conflicts of antiquity, remembered for the audacity of Hannibal, Carthage's brilliant general. Hannibal shocked the world by leading his army, including elephants, across the Alps into Italy. At battles such as Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and especially Cannae in 216 BCE, Hannibal inflicted devastating defeats upon Roman armies. At Cannae, tens of thousands of Romans fell in a single day, a trauma that echoed for generations. Yet Rome, true to its character, refused to yield. The Republic raised new legions, endured loss after loss, and slowly turned the tide. Rome's strategy shifted under the leadership of Fabius Maximus, who avoided pitched battles with Hannibal, earning him the nickname the Delayer. Over time, Rome opened new fronts, sending armies into Spain and eventually striking at Carthage itself. In 22 BCE, at the Battle of Zama, Roman general Scipio, later called Africanus, defeated Hannibal decisively. The Second Punic War ended with Rome supreme, Carthage reduced to a dependent state, and much of the western Mediterranean under Roman control. The Third Punic War, 149 to 146 BCE, was shorter but brutal. Fearing a revival of Carthaginian power, Rome demanded impossible concessions and then laid siege to the city. After a desperate defense, Carthage fell. The Romans razed it to the ground, and although the oft-repeated story of salting the earth is likely myth, the destruction was real. Carthage was erased as a rival, and Rome's dominance in the west was absolute. As Rome fought Carthage, it also expanded eastward into the Greek world. The Macedonian Wars brought Rome into conflict with the successors of Alexander the Great. Victories over Macedon and the Seleucid Empire gradually placed Greece and Asia Minor under Roman influence. Unlike the devastation wrought upon Carthage, the Romans often admired Greek culture, adopting its art, literature, and philosophy. By the 2nd century BCE, Rome was as much a Hellenistic power as it was Italian, blending Latin pragmatism with Greek sophistication. The Mediterranean, once a sea of competing powers, now began to resemble what the Romans called Mare Nostrum, our sea. Provinces sprang up across Spain, Africa, Greece, and Asia Minor. Governors were dispatched to administer these territories, while Roman roads and colonies spread civilization outward. The wealth of empire poured into Rome: grain from Egypt and Sicily, silver from Spain, marble and statues from Greece, and slaves captured in war. This flood of riches transformed Roman society, deepening inequalities but also creating new opportunities. Daily life in this expanding world grew more complex. In Rome itself, markets overflowed with exotic goods: spices from the East, fabrics from Asia, and wine from distant provinces. The population swelled, with migrants and slaves filling the city's crowded streets. Public spectacles grew larger, funded by generals and politicians eager to win favor. Amphitheaters, baths, and temples dotted the urban landscape, offering leisure and grandeur to citizens who increasingly identified themselves not just as Romans of Italy, but as rulers of the known world. Yet expansion also carried burdens. The influx of slaves displaced small farmers, as wealthy landowners amassed vast estates, or latifundia. These estates relied on cheap labor, while ordinary citizens found themselves struggling to compete. The old balance between patricians and plebeians grew strained as wealth concentrated in the hands of a few. Rome's governing institutions, designed for a city-state, now strained to manage an empire. Ambition among generals and politicians grew unchecked, foreshadowing the turbulence to come. Still, the achievement of these centuries remains remarkable. In less than 200 years, Rome transformed from a regional power in Italy to the mistress of the Mediterranean. The Punic Wars tested its endurance, while Eastern campaigns broadened its horizons. Rome's armies proved nearly invincible, but more than that, its capacity to absorb, adapt, and persist defined its success. As we pause here, drifting into reflection, imagine the Mediterranean at twilight, its waters calm, dotted with Roman ships bearing grain, marble, and olive oil. Picture the harbors of Rome filled with voices in many languages, the mingling of cultures under the umbrella of Roman authority. The world has become wider, richer, and more interconnected, yet also more fragile. Rome, triumphant, stands at the peak of its republic, but beneath the surface, tensions stir. For wealth, power, and ambition often plant the seeds of discord, and Rome's next chapter will be one of civil strife. The victories of Rome in the Mediterranean brought unprecedented wealth, prestige, and territory, but they also exposed the republic's weaknesses. With each conquest came new strains upon its political system, its economy, and its social fabric. By the late 2nd and 1st centuries BCE, Rome entered an age of turbulence in which the old balance of the republic faltered under the weight of ambition, inequality, and unrest. This chapter tells the story of how the republic unraveled, culminating in the rise of Julius Caesar and the end of republican rule. The roots of crisis lay in the transformation of Rome's society after the Punic Wars. Wealth poured into the city from newly conquered provinces, but it flowed disproportionately to the aristocracy and ambitious generals. Vast estates, known as latifundia, spread across the countryside, worked by slaves captured in war. Small farmers, once the backbone of the Roman citizen soldier army, were displaced and driven into the city. In Rome itself, unemployment and poverty grew, while political competition among elites grew more intense. The Republic's institutions, designed for a city-state, struggled to govern a Mediterranean empire. Amid these challenges, reformers arose. The brothers Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, serving as tribunes of the plebs in the late 2nd century BCE, attempted to redistribute land to dispossessed citizens and to check the power of the Senate. Their reforms were bold, but their methods bypassed traditional procedures, alarming conservatives. Both brothers were ultimately killed in episodes of political violence. Their fates marked a turning point. Disputes once resolved through compromise now spilled into bloodshed. The precedent of violence in politics would haunt the Republic thereafter. Military reforms also altered the Republic's character. Traditionally, only property-owning citizens served as soldiers, tying military service to land and civic duty. But in 107 BCE, Gaius Marius opened the legions to the poor, creating a professional army loyal less to the state than to their generals. Soldiers now depended on their commanders for pay, plunder, and land after retirement. This shift gave ambitious leaders immense power, as armies followed personal loyalty rather than republican institutions. The The rivalry between Marius and his former subordinate Sulla brought civil war to Rome in the early 1st century BCE. Sulla marched his army upon Rome itself, an unprecedented act that shattered the taboo against bringing soldiers into the sacred city. Twice dictator, Sulla attempted to restore senatorial authority by curbing the powers of the tribunes and assemblies. His reforms proved temporary, but his example of seizing power by force emboldened future leaders. As the century advanced, new figures dominated the stage. The rise of Pompey, a general celebrated for victories in the East, and Crassus, one of Rome's wealthiest men, reflected the increasing role of personal power. Alongside them stood Julius Caesar, a patrician by birth but skilled in winning popular support. Together, they formed the so-called First Triumvirate, an informal alliance that allowed them to dominate Roman politics in the 50s BCE. Each had ambitions. Pompey sought land for his veterans, Crassus longed for military glory, and Caesar desired a command that would elevate him to unmatched prominence. Caesar's opportunity came in Gaul. Appointed governor in 58 BCE, he waged campaigns that expanded Rome's territory to the English Channel and the Rhine. His commentaries on the Gallic War, written in clear, direct prose, both documented his achievements and served as propaganda for audiences in Rome. His victories brought immense wealth and loyalty from his legions, but they also alarmed rivals, especially Pompey, who by the late 50s had drifted toward the Senate's side. Tensions culminated in 49 BCE when the Senate, pressured by Pompey and his allies, ordered Caesar to disband his army and return to Rome. Instead, Caesar crossed the Rubicon River with his troops, a decisive act of defiance. "The die is cast," he is said to have declared. Civil war followed. Caesar marched swiftly into Italy, driving Pompey and the Senate to flee to Greece. At Pharsalus in 48 BCE, Caesar defeated Pompey's forces, and Pompey himself fled to Egypt, where he was assassinated. With Pompey gone, Caesar consolidated power across the Roman world. Caesar's rule was marked by both reform and controversy. He reorganized the calendar, creating the Julian system that closely resembles the one we still use. He settled veterans, expanded citizenship, and centralized administration. Yet his accumulation of power alarmed traditionalists. In 44 BCE, he was appointed dictator for life, a title that seemed to revive monarchy under another name. On the Ides of March, a group of senators, among them Brutus and Cassius, assassinated him in the Senate House, hoping to restore the Republic. But Caesar's death did not bring a return to the old order. Instead, it unleashed further conflict. His supporters rallied around his grandnephew and adopted heir, Octavian, along with the experienced general Mark Antony. Rome descended into another round of civil wars, as the Republic fractured irreparably. The fall of the Republic was not a single event, but a long unraveling. Political violence, social inequality, personal armies, and the ambitions of extraordinary individuals all undermined the delicate balance of checks and traditions. By the mid-1st century BCE, the Republic's framework could no longer contain the scale of power Rome commanded. Caesar's rise and fall symbolized both the Republic's greatness and its limits, a system designed to prevent kingship, undone by the allure of empire. As you settle into rest, imagine the city of Rome during these turbulent years. Senators whisper in the forum, plebeians crowd the streets demanding grain, and legions camp beyond the walls, loyal not to the Senate but to their general. Torches flicker in the night as rumors of plots circulate. It is a city alive with ambition, fear, and hope. The Republic, once steady, now trembles under the weight of its own success, as the first emperor waits in the shadows of history. The death of Julius Caesar left Rome suspended between the memory of its republic and the reality of personal rule. Into this uncertain world stepped Caesar's adopted son and heir, Octavian, a youth of only 18. His rise to power, culminating in the title Augustus, marked the transition from republic to empire. In this chapter, we follow the careful steps by which Augustus consolidated authority, reimagined governance, and established a new order that would endure for centuries. At first, Octavian seemed an unlikely ruler. Lacking military experience and political stature, he inherited only Caesar's name and fortune. Yet these were powerful assets. Declaring himself Divi Filius, son of the deified one, he cast his legitimacy in divine terms. In alliance with Mark Antony, Caesar's trusted lieutenant, and Marcus Lepidus, a high-ranking official, Octavian formed the Second Triumvirate in 43 BCE. Unlike Caesar's informal arrangement with Pompey and Crassus, this triumvirate was officially sanctioned by law, granting them near absolute power. Together, the triumvirs pursued vengeance against Caesar's assassins. Proscriptions, lists of enemies marked for execution and property seizure, spread fear through Rome, claiming even Cicero, the great orator and defender of the Republic. Brutus and Cassius, the leaders of the conspiracy, were defeated at the Battle of Philippi in 42 BCE. Rome was avenged, but the Republic was beyond repair. Tensions soon emerged among the triumvirs. Lepidus faded into obscurity, leaving Octavian and Antony to divide the Roman world between them. Antony took the east, forging a partnership and romance with Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt. Octavian controlled the west, building his base of power in Italy. Propaganda became a weapon. Octavian portrayed Antony as a man seduced by an Eastern queen, betraying Roman values, while presenting himself as the guardian of tradition and stability. The rivalry culminated in 31 BCE at the naval battle of Actium. Octavian's fleet, commanded by his admiral Agrippa, defeated Antony and Cleopatra. The couple fled to Egypt, where, a year later, both took their own lives as Octavian's forces closed in. With their deaths, Octavian stood unchallenged as master of the Roman world. Yet Octavian was cautious. He understood that Rome's citizens still clung to the language of the Republic, even if its substance had long since withered. In 27 BCE, he carefully staged what became known as the First Settlement. He presented himself as restoring power to the Senate and people of Rome, only to have those same bodies grant him unprecedented authority. They bestowed upon him the title Augustus, meaning the revered one, a name that carried religious as well as political resonance. Officially, Augustus was merely the first citizen, princeps, but in reality, he held supreme command of the military, control of provinces, and the loyalty of legions. The Republic's forms endured, but its essence had changed. Augustus's rule was marked less by dramatic conquest than by careful consolidation. He reformed the army, creating permanent legions stationed along the empire's frontiers and establishing a treasury to fund them. Veterans received land or settlements, reducing the unrest that had once plagued Rome. He reorganized provinces, distinguishing between those under senatorial control and those governed directly by him. The imperial bureaucracy began to take shape, staffed by equestrians and freedmen whose loyalty lay with the emperor rather than rival aristocrats. Public life flourished under Augustus's patronage. He embarked on an ambitious building program, boasting that he found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. Temples to Jupiter, Mars the Avenger, and Augustus himself adorned the capital, while theaters, forums, and aqueducts improved civic life. These works were more than stone. They were symbols of renewal, reminding Romans that stability and grandeur had returned. Augustus also reshaped society through moral legislation. Concerned with declining birth rates among the elite, he encouraged marriage and penalized adultery, even exiling his own daughter Julia for scandalous behavior. He sought to revive traditional Roman virtues of duty, discipline, and piety, presenting himself as the model of moderation. The poet Virgil's Aeneid, commissioned during his reign, embodied these ideals, telling of Rome's divine destiny through the hero Aeneas, whose qualities mirrored those Augustus claimed for himself. Though wars did not vanish, Augustus ushered in a relative peace known as the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. Borders were stabilized, revolts suppressed, and commerce expanded across the Mediterranean. Roads and sea routes thrived, with merchants carrying grain from Egypt, wine from Gaul, olive oil from Spain, and silk from the East. In this climate of prosperity, Roman culture flourished, blending influences from Italy, Greece, and beyond. The image of Augustus himself was carefully curated. Statues depicted him as youthful and idealized, linking him to divine ancestry through Venus and Aeneas. He accepted titles such as Pontifex Maximus, chief priest, blending religious authority with political power. Yet he never wore a crown, never called himself king. His genius lay in maintaining the illusion of republican continuity while wielding imperial command. By the time of his death in 14 CE, Augustus had ruled for more than 4 decades. His passing was marked by solemn ceremonies, and the Senate declared him a god, cementing his place among the divine. He left behind not only an empire, but a model of governance that blended tradition with monarchy, laying the foundation for centuries of emperors to follow. As you drift into rest, imagine Rome at twilight under Augustus. Marble temples glowing in lamplight, aqueducts carrying fresh water into the city, poets reciting verses of destiny, and soldiers standing guard at distant frontiers. The civil wars are over, the republic is gone, and in its place rises a new order, steady and radiant. The world breathes easier, as if lulled by the calm voice of the first emperor. The reign of Augustus opened the door to a long era of stability and prosperity that Romans came to know as the Pax Romana, or Roman peace. This period, stretching from the 1st century BCE into the 2nd century CE, was not entirely free from conflict, but compared with the turbulence of the late Republic, it felt like calm after a storm. It was during these centuries that the Roman Empire reached its greatest flourishing, not only in terms of territory, but in culture, architecture, and the rhythms of daily life. To listen to this chapter is to stroll slowly through the empire at its height, where order and magnificence coexisted with ordinary routines and simple pleasures. At the heart of the Pax Romana stood the city of Rome itself. With more than 1 million inhabitants by the 2nd century CE, it was the largest urban center of the ancient world. Aqueducts carried fresh water across miles of countryside into fountains and baths. The Colosseum, completed under the Flavian emperors, stood as a marvel of engineering, capable of holding tens of thousands who came to watch gladiators, animal hunts, and staged naval battles. The Roman Forum, lined with temples and basilicas, remained the stage of civic life. Statues, arches, and triumphal columns reminded citizens daily of the empire's grandeur. But the empire was more than its capital. Across provinces from Spain to Syria, from Gaul to Egypt, Rome's influence was visible in cities built to a familiar plan. A forum at the center, straight roads dividing neighborhoods, amphitheaters, baths, and temples rising as symbols of Roman presence. These cities were both administrative hubs and cultural bridges, where local traditions mingled with Roman customs. Latin and Greek were spoken side by side. Roman law provided order, while local practices gave variety. Economically, the empire was a web of trade and production. Grain from Egypt fed Rome's population, olive oil from Spain filled amphorae stacked in warehouses, and wine from Gaul was poured in taverns. Glassware from the Levant, silk from China via the Silk Road, and spices from India all found their way into Roman markets. Roads, straight, stone-paved, and enduring, stretched thousands of miles, linking frontier camps to bustling harbors. The Mediterranean itself became a Roman lake, its waters busy with merchant ships carrying the goods of an interconnected world. For ordinary people, daily life varied by class and region, but certain patterns were shared. In cities, apartment blocks known as insula housed much of the population. These could be cramped and precarious, with the poorest families squeezed into upper floors. Wealthier citizens lived in spacious homes with courtyards, mosaics, and painted walls. Meals often featured bread, olives, and cheese for the common folk, while the rich dined on fish, fruits, and imported delicacies. Public baths offered not only cleanliness, but also social gathering, where people of different backgrounds could meet, exercise, and converse. Entertainment was abundant. The amphitheater offered spectacles of gladiatorial combat and animal hunts, both brutal and mesmerizing. Chariot races in the Circus Maximus drew immense crowds, their cheers echoing across the city as teams competed for glory. Theaters staged plays, often adapted from Greek originals, while poets recited epic or satirical verse. Festivals honoring gods and emperors alike punctuated the calendar with music, feasts, and processions. These diversions were not merely leisure, they reinforced Roman identity and loyalty to the state. Religion, too, played a central role. Traditional Roman gods were honored with temples and rituals, but the empire was open to a wide range of beliefs. Eastern cults of Isis and Mithras found followers, while the worship of the emperors as divine figures grew steadily. Shrines to household gods stood in homes, while grand ceremonies in temples reinforced the connection between piety and civic duty. This religious pluralism created a rich spiritual landscape, though it sometimes led to tension with traditions that resisted integration, such as the early Christians. The Pax Romana also fostered intellectual and artistic life. Writers such as Ovid, Livy, Seneca, and Pliny the Elder created works that captured Roman thought and imagination. Architects experimented with concrete, arches, and domes, producing structures of lasting influence like the Pantheon. Sculptors blended Greek idealism with Roman realism, producing portraits that conveyed both grandeur and individuality. These cultural achievements were not confined to the elite. Inscriptions, graffiti, and local art testify to the voices and creativity of ordinary Romans as well. Yet beneath the calm, challenges remained. Social inequality persisted, with vast differences between the wealthy elite and the poor masses. Slavery was widespread, forming the backbone of agriculture, mining, and household labor. Frontiers required constant vigilance, as legions defended the Rhine, the Danube, and the deserts of the east. Rebellions occasionally erupted, most famously the Jewish revolts in Judea, which required heavy suppression. Still, the overall sense of order was strong enough that generations of Romans came to expect peace as the natural state of their world. The emperors who followed Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero, and the Flavian dynasty varied in their abilities and reputations. Some were remembered for cruelty or extravagance, others for stability and expansion. Yet the system Augustus designed endured. By the time of the so-called five good emperors in the 2nd century, Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, the empire reached its height. Trajan extended Rome's borders to their greatest expanse, while Hadrian consolidated them, building his famous wall in Britain. These rulers embodied a balance of authority and benevolence, fostering prosperity that made the Pax Romana a golden age in the Roman memory. As you let your mind settle, picture the empire at nightfall. In Rome, lamps flicker along the marble colonnades of the Forum. In distant provinces, soldiers patrol quiet roads, merchants rest in inns after long journeys, and farmers tend to animals in simple courtyards. Across this vast expanse, millions live under the same laws, trade in the same coinage, and recognize the same emperor. The world seems ordered, stable, and serene, a world that, for a time, feels eternal. Even the most enduring peace is not everlasting. By the late 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, cracks began to appear in the seemingly solid foundation of the Roman Empire. What had once been steady and flourishing now showed signs of strain: political instability, economic challenges, external pressures, and internal transformation. This period, often called the crisis of the 3rd century, did not mark the end of Rome, but it did alter its character profoundly. In this chapter, we drift gently through these centuries of change, watching as Rome faltered, adapted, and embraced new spiritual horizons. The first sign of trouble was political. The succession of emperors, never firmly regulated, became increasingly unstable. After the death of Marcus Aurelius in 180 CE, his son Commodus ruled with extravagance and cruelty, marking a decline from the stability of the five good emperors. In the century that followed, Rome endured waves of assassinations, short-lived rulers, and usurpers. Armies, whose loyalty often lay with their generals rather than the state, elevated their commanders to imperial power, only for rivals to depose them. In less than 50 years during the 3rd century, Rome saw dozens of emperors, many ruling only briefly before being struck down. This political chaos was accompanied by economic strain. The costs of maintaining Rome's vast frontiers grew immense. To pay the legions, emperors debased the currency, reducing its silver content. Inflation followed, and confidence in Roman coinage eroded. Trade slowed, and local economies grew more self-sufficient, reducing the flow of goods that once animated the Mediterranean. Agricultural output also suffered in some regions, disrupted by invasions, taxation, or neglect. The once steady hum of prosperity faltered. External pressures added to the turmoil. Along the northern frontiers, Germanic tribes pushed against the Rhine and Danube. In the east, a revitalized Persian Empire challenged Roman dominance, even capturing the Emperor Valerian in 260 CE, a humiliation that shocked the empire. Barbarian incursions, once sporadic, became more organized and dangerous. Though Roman legions fought valiantly, the sheer length of the borders and the constant demands of defense stretched resources thin. Amid this turbulence, society continued to evolve. Cities, once the proud symbols of Roman order, struggled with declining populations and shrinking revenues. In contrast, the countryside grew more central, as large estates provided security and sustenance. The traditional role of Rome itself as the singular center of power diminished, as emperors often resided closer to the frontiers where military action demanded their presence. Yet the Roman world was not only weakening, it was also transforming in ways that would shape its future. One of the most profound changes was the rise of Christianity. What began as a small persecuted sect within Judea gradually spread across the empire. Christians met in secret, sharing meals and prayers, refusing to honor the traditional gods or the divinity of the emperor. This refusal sometimes brought persecution, as emperors saw it as a challenge to civic unity. But persecution could not extinguish the faith. By the 3rd century, Christianity had spread widely, appealing to both poor and wealthy, offering a message of hope, equality, and eternal life. Other religious movements also flourished. The cult of Mithras, popular among soldiers, offered rituals of initiation and loyalty. Devotion to Isis and other Eastern deities continued, blending Roman and foreign traditions. The empire became a spiritual crossroads where old gods and new faiths mingled. In this environment of uncertainty, people sought meaning and protection beyond the traditional rites of the state. Despite the crises, Rome was not destined to collapse at once. Strong leaders emerged to stabilize the empire. The Emperor Aurelian, in the late 3rd century, reconquered breakaway regions, earning the title Restorer of the World. Diocletian, rising later, undertook sweeping reforms. He divided the empire into eastern and western halves for easier administration, created new provinces, and reorganized the army. To impose stability, he also launched the most systematic persecution of Christians, though it ultimately failed to halt the religion's growth. Daily life in this era reflected both continuity and change. In towns that remained stable, people still visited baths, markets, and theaters. Roads carried legions and merchants alike, though less bustling than in the height of the Pax Romana. Villas in the countryside continued to produce wine, oil, and grain, sustaining local communities. Yet anxiety was palpable. Frontier raids, inflation, and shifting rulers made the future uncertain. Families turned more toward local patronage and religious communities for support, adjusting to a world less unified by imperial strength. The transformation of Rome in these centuries reminds us that empires do not end in a single moment, but bend, adapt, and reshape themselves under pressure. The Republic had once given way to the empire. Now the classical empire of marble cities and stable rule was giving way to something new, an empire that would be more divided, more spiritual, and in some ways, more fragile. As you close your eyes, imagine the empire at dusk during this era. On one frontier, soldiers keep watch along wooden palisades, their fires glowing in the cold night. In a distant villa, farmers gather around a hearth, praying to old gods or perhaps to the new faith of Christ. In the capital, senators whisper anxiously about the latest change of rulers. The empire endures, but its pulse is uneven, its voice changing. It is no longer the Rome of Augustus, but a Rome searching for renewal. The long history of Rome does not end abruptly, but gradually, like a flame that flickers before fading. The Western Roman Empire, though weakened by centuries of strain, persisted until 476 CE, when the last emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed. Yet Rome's story is more than its fall. Its legacy endured in law, language, religion, and memory, shaping Europe and the wider world for millennia to come. In this final section, we drift gently through the empire's twilight and reflect on the echoes it left behind. By the 4th century CE, the empire had already undergone profound transformation. Diocletian's division of the empire into east and west created 2 administrative centers. The eastern half, with its wealthier provinces and strong defenses, increasingly took precedence. In 330 CE, Emperor Constantine founded a new capital at Byzantium, renamed Constantinople. Strategically placed between Europe and Asia, this city would become the heart of the Byzantine Empire, ensuring that Rome's Eastern legacy continued long after the West declined. Constantine himself is remembered for another transformation, the embrace of Christianity. In 313 CE, the Edict of Milan granted religious tolerance throughout the empire, ending centuries of persecution. Constantine's own conversion, whether gradual or sudden, gave Christianity imperial favor. By the end of the 4th century, under Theodosius I, Christianity became the official religion of the empire. Pagan temples fell silent while churches rose across cities and countryside. bishops gained influence, and the cross replaced the eagle as the empire's unifying symbol. This spiritual shift ensured that even as political power faltered, Rome's cultural and religious impact deepened. The Western Empire, however, faced mounting challenges. Barbarian groups, Visigoths, Vandals, Ostrogoths, and others, pressed against its borders, drawn by both Rome's wealth and by pressures from migrating peoples farther east. Some entered as allies or foederati, granted land in exchange for military service. Others invaded more forcefully. In 410 CE, Rome itself was sacked by the Visigoths under Alaric, a shocking event that shattered the aura of invincibility the Eternal City had carried for centuries. Later, in 455 CE, the Vandals plundered the city again, their name becoming forever linked with destruction. These invasions were not simply moments of violence, but signs of deeper shifts. The Roman army, once composed of citizen soldiers, now relied heavily on federated tribes and mercenaries. Loyalties fractured, economic troubles continued, taxation burdened the population, trade diminished, and urban centers declined. The grandeur of marble forums and amphitheaters gave way to smaller, humbler communities. In this changing world, the old structures of empire struggled to hold. The final chapter of the Western Empire came in 476 CE. The Germanic chieftain Odoacer deposed Romulus Augustulus, a boy emperor whose very name, Romulus, the founder, and Augustus, the first emperor, seemed a symbolic bookend. Odoacer did not claim the title of emperor, but instead ruled Italy as king under nominal recognition of the Eastern emperor. Though historians mark this date as the fall of Rome, for contemporaries it felt less like a sudden collapse than a transition. Life in towns and villages continued, though under new rulers. The Roman Senate still convened for a time, Roman law still influenced governance, and the Latin language persisted. Indeed, in the East, the empire continued for nearly 1,000 years more, evolving into the Byzantine Empire. Its capital at Constantinople, with mighty walls and thriving trade, preserved Roman law, Greek culture, and Christian faith. When later generations spoke of Rome, it was often Byzantium they had in mind, even as the memory of the old capital lingered. The legacy of Rome stretched even farther. Roman law provided a foundation for medieval and modern legal systems, with concepts of contracts, citizenship, and justice shaping governance long after emperors had passed. Latin, the language of Rome, lived on as the tongue of the church, of scholarship, and eventually as the root of modern Romance languages: Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Romanian. Architecture, with its arches, domes, and aqueducts, inspired builders from medieval cathedrals to modern capitals. The idea of Rome itself became a symbol of authority. Medieval popes claimed the mantle of Rome's spiritual leadership, crowning emperors in the name of continuity. Charlemagne, crowned in 800 CE, styled his realm as a Holy Roman Empire, while even the Russian czars saw themselves as heirs of Rome, calling Moscow the Third Rome. The Roman dream of order, unity, and grandeur never truly vanished, and yet Rome's story is also human. It is the tale of farmers and soldiers, merchants and slaves, senators and emperors. It is the daily life of crowded tenements and luxurious villas, of bread baked in communal ovens and water flowing through aqueducts. It is the sound of sandals on stone streets, the laughter of children in forums, the prayers whispered in temples and later in churches. These quiet details, as much as battles and decrees, are what endure in the imagination. To drift into sleep with Rome's history is to imagine both its rise and its twilight. Picture the Forum in ruins, grass sprouting between marble columns, yet shepherds still guiding flocks nearby. Picture the Colosseum, its games ended, now echoing with silence, but still standing as a monument to ambition. Picture monks in distant monasteries copying Latin texts by candlelight, preserving Rome's wisdom for future centuries. In these images, Rome lives on, not as an empire of armies, but as an empire of memory. Rome's empire has ended, but Rome itself never truly falls. It persists in the words we speak, the laws we follow, the buildings we admire, and the stories we tell. As you rest, let the centuries pass like waves on the shore, carrying the echoes of Rome across time. The empire fades into the night, but its spirit lingers, quiet and eternal.